Hello, I'm Mark Esper, former United States Secretary of Defense and the John S. McCain Distinguished Fellow at the McCain Institute for International Leadership in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. I'm proud to welcome you to the next installment of our program. Today, I'm honored to welcome a longtime friend of the United States and of mine, the current Australian Minister of Government Services and National Disability Insurance Scheme, and the former Minister of Defense, Linda Reynolds. Relations between the United States and Australia have never been closer, as we've seen in recent weeks. President Joe Biden met with Prime Minister Scott Morrison just last month in Washington and celebrated the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-Australia alliance. As such, Minister Reynolds and I will discuss the Biden administration's efforts to make engagement with our Indo-Pacific partners a top foreign policy priority, with a focus on China, and what that looks like from Australia. Over the last several months, we've seen President Biden meet personally with members of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. The Quad, as we call it, includes Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, and its unspoken focus is on defending the international rules-based order against China. Consistent with this theme, and to its credit, Australia has stood by its principles and stood up to Beijing's growing authoritarianism and heavy-handed behavior in the region, and has paid an economic price for doing so as a result. On the military front, the Biden administration reached a secret accord with the UK to sell nuclear submarine technology to Australia, which is an important step forward to improving the capabilities and capacity of our ally down under when it comes to deterring Beijing. Finally, many are waiting to see the direction President Biden will take the country when it comes to US-China trade and economic relations. Will he remove Trump-era tariffs on Beijing? Will he clamp down harder on Chinese technology theft? Will he join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the United States helped negotiate to conclusion as the TPP in 2016, but which the Trump administration declined to join? While Canberra pursues a comprehensive strategy to advance its diplomatic interests, economic goals, and safeguard its security, these issues and more will factor into their plans. We have the perfect guest today to help inform, enlighten, and guide us on these matters. Minister Linda Reynolds has served in a variety of high-level political roles throughout her illustrious career. In addition to serving in her current role as Minister for Government Services and National Disability Insurance Scheme, Linda Reynolds is an elected senator representing Western Australia, a position she was elected to in 2014 and re-elected to in 2016 and 2019. She has also served as Minister for Defense, Minister for Defense Industry, Minister for Emergency Management and North Queensland Recovery, and Assistant Minister for Home Affairs. As I mentioned, Minister Reynolds is a champion of the longstanding US-Australia partnership, so it is my honor to welcome her here today. Minister Reynolds, Linda, welcome. Great to see you again.
Mark, thank you so much. It is my absolute pleasure to see you again and to join you. And can I also thank the McCain Foundation for this fantastic opportunity. Look, can I just say up front that our two nations have a very special and a unique bond, and one that continues to have global significance. So together we've now entered our second century of unbroken friendship. And also we've had 81 years of diplomatic relations, and this year 70 years of ANZUS cooperation. But I think, Mark, as you and I discovered, that together our defence relationship goes back over 100 years. And I don't know if you remember, but at the 2019 AUSMIN meeting in Sydney, you gave me a photo of US and Australian soldiers side by side at the Battle of Hamel. And it takes a lot to render me speechless, but you almost achieved that. Because what you could not possibly have known was that my own grandfather, Alfred Reynolds, could have been one of those stretcher bearers in that photo that you gave to me. And it was there at Hamel over 100 years ago where my grandfather first met and served, with American soldiers. In fact, it was there at Hamel that he taught his new American mates how to make the hard decisions about who to save on the battlefield and who to leave. And these are lessons that he first learnt in the trenches of Gallipoli, supporting British forces. And since then, as you and I both know, we've had generations of Australians and Americans who have fought side by side, as we still do today. And can I just say that there's no more fitting organisation to have this conversation today than with the McCain Institute. And as I said, I thank you very much for that opportunity, because it's an institute inspired by the leadership of Senator John McCain, but also inspired by the service of his own family. And John Sidney McCain III was a great friend of Australia, and his loss is still very deeply felt here. And we know that no one was more committed to our alliance between our two nations than Senator McCain was. And it was also very clear to us here in Australia that Senator McCain really understood the modern challenges that both our nations face, and also the vital roles that we both play in the Indo-Pacific, roles that are consistent but not necessarily identical. And there's a very famous quote from Senator McCain, and he said this. He said that his family had literally been sailing and flying around Australia and the Pacific for most of the past century, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And that family tradition continued with his grandfather, John McCain Sr., who actually first sailed to Australia in 1908 aboard the Great White Fleet. And his own father, during the campaign of the Pacific, captained a submarine, which is little known, but it was based right here in Perth, in Western Australia, where I live today. And Admiral McCain had great links to Australia during the Vietnam War. Senator McCain himself also spent time in Australia on his naval deployments. And finally, and most recently, both of his sons, Jimmy and Jack, became the fourth generation of McCains to serve alongside Australian soldiers in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And Mark, the reason I mention both of these stories is that these connections are not unusual, as our men and women have served side by side through every major battle over the last century. And these relationships, I think, are really important, but they can't be taken for granted. So while we've had this century of mateship, a century of fighting for shared values, it requires great leadership. It did then, and it still does today. And just as you and I saw every day, where that relationship and that friendship has taken us in our joint facilities, with staff embedded at Indo-PACOM, that is still there today. And I'll just finish by saying this, is that, as we saw, you can't buy or coerce true friendship and deep trust. And I think that is the true strength that we share today, and particularly as we tackle the challenges in our region. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Linda, for recalling such a rich history between our two countries, and of course, your own personal poignant reminders of that as it affects you and your family. And it does speak a great deal to the strong partnership between Australia and the United States, and something that we intend to continue and build upon. And I think today's discussion will help enable that as well. So with that, let me just begin by asking you what you made of President Biden's and Prime Minister Morrison's in-person meeting last month.
Well, I think that it was significant on many levels. We celebrated last month the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty, and what we saw between both our leaders is the next logical extension of that. And it's somewhat hard to pronounce, but the AUKUS Agreement is as important as it is difficult, I think, to pronounce. But what we saw is the realisation of that 100 years of working together and serving together, and a common acknowledgement that we have a responsibility to work together in our region to preserve the rules-based order, to preserve sovereignty, but also to preserve the principles and the values that we have fought for over 100 years. And the partnership that we saw between my Prime Minister and your President, I think is a demonstration of the importance of that trust and that relationship, but also it was actually an extension of a number of the agreements that you and I signed together last year at AUSMIN in 2020 in terms of deeper technological engagements and greater interoperability, force posture agreements here in Australia and across the region. So I just thought it was brilliant.
Well, thank you for that. You mentioned September 1st, 2021, marking the 70th anniversary of the Australia, New Zealand, and United States Security Treaty, which of course brings together America's closest Pacific allies to protect the security of the region. So I want to talk about the nuclear accord that you just mentioned, but as you look back over the past 7 decades, are there any critical lessons learned that you haven't already touched upon that we should try to apply as we go forward?
Mark, that's a really great question. And I think one of the important issues for us to remember is that our relationship is not just about shared security, both bilaterally and multilaterally in our region. Our relationship is also about the second stabiliser of democracy, which is economic security. And so our mutual investments in the region and our exercise of soft power, both unilaterally and bilaterally, it plays a really critical role, not only in national security, but also in the economic security of our region. And that is particularly so now given the damage that COVID-19 has caused, and also the increased instability that it has caused in our region. So we've all long championed economic development, not only for economic security, but also for economic and also national security. One of the things that I frequently in speeches here and overseas that I quite often refer to is a little known, or perhaps a little remembered US statute called the US Lend-Lease Act of 1941. And I recall it because I think it is just as significant today, the principles that it represented, as it was back in the 1940s. And Winston Churchill, sort of in the middle of World War II, calls your Lend-Lease Act the most unsordid act in recorded history. Now, that's a pretty big call for a Prime Minister fighting for his nation's survival. But why it was so important and remains important is that President Roosevelt and the US Congress passed this bill to actually promote the defence of the United States by supporting its allies. So in that case, Great Britain, and then Australia and others. But it provided those economic levers and the military levers to finish the war. But also it was really clear then during the war that both Roosevelt, Churchill, and our leaders here in Australia were not only fighting and prosecuting the war, but they were also thinking about how to reconstruct the post-war economy and the security architecture, which included the Marshall Plan and many of the institutions that we rely on today for rules-based order. So I think what this tells me and others, I hope, is that this ability for like-minded leaders to simultaneously manage peace and prosperity is just as relevant as it was then as it is today. And I think you can see that weaving through some of the agreements that we signed together, and now particularly AUKUS, is that we have to do things differently. Our world is changing. And as you and I discussed often, and it sits at the heart of AUKUS now, is that the Indo-Pacific is unquestionably in the midst of what we say is the most consequential strategic realignment since World War II, since those institutions were created. And it has significantly complicated both of our nation's strategic circumstances. I think the other thing that it has shown is that what happens in our region, in Australia, we are a 3-ocean nation. I think, as I may have mentioned to you several times, and brought maps to sort of demonstrate what the strategic environment in those 3 oceans looks like for us. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, and again represented in AUKUS, is that what happens here matters to us all globally.
Well, thank you for that. Very important points, particularly on the economic and diplomatic. That said, I want to stick with the security for a while. And you mentioned, our World War II and what came out of that. Australia is one of the United States' most important intelligence allies and a member of the Five Eyes community, which is another foundational relationship for the US and Australia, and of course, Great Britain and others. Can you speak to the role this select forum plays in Australia's strategic decision-making in the Indo-Pacific?
Look, I can, and the Five Eyes is often described as the jewel in the crown of our respective intelligence relationships. And again, it's something that we've both seen in action from our intelligence agencies and also our military. And I think that it is indisputably a mutually beneficial alliance for all of us. But again, it's one that has taken decades to nurture and to grow. And it only works because of the trust that exists between us at all levels. And as you and I experience, Five Eyes are always better than one. And it's not just in intelligence, but we also worked to re-enliven the Five Eyes amongst defence secretaries and ministers. And I certainly found that having that level of dialogue and deep discussion that's not sort of informed by notes simply from our advisors and our officials, but it is true conversation and depth and an exchange of ideas. And I think that was for me, that was one of the most important areas, not just intelligence, but as we took it into the defence realm, is that we can have honest, unfiltered discussions. But the other point I would make is that what I found of great benefit was the fact that we didn't all have to have the same point of view, and that we could throw things on the table to discuss and to advocate for, but also to listen to different points of view that I think enriched our conversations, but also enrich the outcomes of where we have, where we've landed, and I'm sure where our successors are now taking that dialogue further.
Thank you for that. And you reminded me that I recall during our service together in the summer of 2020, you, to your credit, proposed a more frequent Five Eye meetings amongst the defense ministers we would do via secure video. And it was at a time when we were all still wrestling with COVID, and China seemed to be on the march in the South China Sea and the Pacific, trumpeting its alleged success against COVID. But we began doing these quarterly, and it was, to your point, much more than intelligence. It was policy discussion and coordination. And I thought it was a great innovation, and I hope these are still occurring because, like you, I found them very helpful to have these discussions with you, us, and our other Five Eye partners.
Yeah, as did I. And again, you don't always get the opportunity to have frank and fearless discussions, and on these issues, on these such important issues. So that I'm sure they're continuing, and there is no other forum to really truly have those discussions.
President Biden, I mentioned this up front, has spoken about the importance of reaffirming America's Indo-Pacific partnerships. To this end, what do you think the next steps are in the U.S.-Australian bilateral relationship?
In relation to our bilateral relationship, I think that it is in very good health, and we've continued for the last 70 years. It's sort of ebbed and waned a little bit, but I think in terms of our bilateral relationship, it is in very good health, and we can see with AUKUS now and with the submarine agreement that it is sort of not more of the same, but just continue to build and to deepen and to strengthen that relationship. But I think one of the things that is also very important, as you said, is how we work on our relationships within the region. And part of that, and again, you and I did that with ASEAN, with, as you mentioned before, with the Quad, and we recognised, as do the current administrations, that these webs or these relationships of minilaterals and multilateral partnerships within our regions were so important, and that while we may not always share the same cultural norms with all of our regional friends and partners, we all share a common commitment to liberal democracy and also a mutual respect for sovereignty. And I think, as you said, the Quad is a great example of that. The Quad is a very good diplomatic network of 4 like-minded countries who share that commitment to supporting an open, inclusive and a resilient region. And it is certainly becoming a key pillar of both of our Indo-Pacific agendas. But one of the most important points, I think, when having a look at our bilateral, regional and multilateral cooperations is that how they all complement each other. And that particularly is so with ASEAN. Both you and I engaged extensively with ASEAN. And that is, I think, another great example of, because ASEAN sits at the heart, I'll put it this way maybe, that ASEAN sits at the geographic and diplomatic heart of the Indo-Pacific region. And it's a long-standing and highly successful organisation. And largely through, in the 50 years that ASEAN was founded, the Southeast Asia has enjoyed relative peace and stability. And ASEAN has played an important role in that. So while I'd say that both of our nations don't have an identical relationship with ASEAN, they are both inextricably linked to peace and prosperity and security in Southeast Asia and more widely. So our relationships are very complementary and also, I think, very mutually supportive. But I'd leave sort of with this, I think with this reflection, is that our ASEAN partners know that we are both committed to working together with them to make their own region stronger, to make it more prosperous, but also to make it more stable. And I have no doubt that they also know that we respect their sovereignty, and we will support their efforts to support and sustain their own sovereignty. And I think that's perhaps an important differentiator between us and some others.
Well, thank you for that. You actually answered two questions I was going to mention, one being ASEAN and its centrality, and the second being the Quad. That said, I do want to pull the thread just a little bit on the Quad and ask you a quick follow-up, and that is, where do you think the Quad should go next? And should it expand to invite members in such as South Korea?
Look, I think the Quad has the potential to expand, but I think like any arrangements, bilaterally between the four nations, we have very strong relationships, with both Japan and with India. Again, slightly different relationships based on different sort of historical considerations and more contemporary considerations, but I don't think we should force it. I think that the Quad is making some really significant advances, and as we're working more together as a Quad in a range of areas, that's coming together very well. So it may well be that other countries, such as the Republic of Korea, may well join, but if it doesn't, that's okay too, because again, as part of the new relationships that we're building, is that both of us have very strong relationships with the Republic of Korea, and we may find if it doesn't join the Quad, then there are certainly other avenues for us to both of us to further deepen our relationships with the Republic of Korea.
Great points. You and I both mentioned the nuclear technology deal for submarines for Australia a couple times now. And from my perspective, putting on my old hat, it seems like a great move forward of fantastic initiatives. I think, as I mentioned, it'll provide Australia with a greater capacity and capability in terms of its undersea ability to deter China. And if we get in some type of conflict, to deal with it far more effectively. And of course, it brings us together more closely politically, et cetera. But what's your take, putting on your former hat as Minister of Defense? Do you have anything to add to that?
In terms of the submarine agreement itself?
Right.
Look, I think there's a number of points on that. The first one for Australia is we've really had to grapple, and I certainly started grappling with these issues as Minister, which Peter Dutton has now pursued further. But coming back to the reason why for Australia is really that the change in our strategic environments since we went into the agreement on the attack class submarine program in 2016, it has changed quite fundamentally. So we really had to revisit our decision to acquire a conventional submarine. So first and foremost, our strategic environment had changed much faster than we anticipated, something that you and I are discussing today and discussed often in our previous roles. But the stark fact for us is that the Indo-Pacific region is now the absolute centre of global strategic competition, and we are seeing technological disruption and military modernisation at an unprecedented rate. And we came to the conclusion that we needed the best submarine capability to meet our strategic needs for many decades to come, because clearly it's going to be a capability that we will need, with 3 oceans, which are all increasingly contested on all 3 fronts, that was something that we needed. So we did make an assessment through a government capability review process that I did initiate, and it came to the conclusion that nuclear-powered submarines were the only option that could really meet Australia's defence requirements. So while up until this point we haven't been a nuclear nation, we have a small nuclear facilities here, mainly for nuclear medicine, but we really have made quite a significant shift. Now, in relation to that nuclear submarine agreement, it doesn't actually impact on our international norms or broader non-proliferation requirements, because Australia doesn't want and we will not seek nuclear weapons. So this is all about nuclear-powered submarines, not a broader nuclear industry, and particularly nuclear weapons for us.
Right. You made an important point that the global focus has shifted, that now the Indo-Pacific region is I think you call it the strategic epicenter of competition. It's a great point. And so I want to ask your advice here. How should the United States, and maybe with the help of regional allies like Australia and Japan, go about getting more of our European partners on board with confronting China? And maybe it's better said in defending democracy and the rules-based order, because we see China flaunting these rules and norms. Any recommendations or how you might approach it?
Well, far be it from me to tell yourself or your administration how to run their own foreign policies. However, for Australia, as you've touched on, our geostrategic policies are really not based on any single nation, but at the heart of how we interact globally are behaviours. And as we've talked about today, it's particularly in respect for sovereignty and also respect for rules-based order. So how we portray it and communicate it is that we respect others to respect our sovereignty just as we respect theirs, and mutual respect is not negotiable in all of these issues. But in relation to China specifically, we do have a comprehensive China strategy that covers both our bilateral relationship and also broader regional issues, of which we've sort of already touched upon. It's quite a comprehensive strategy, and it traverses security, trade, foreign investment, and of course our foreign policy. So that's in relation to China, but our regional strategy is also fundamental to that, and our regional strategy is really designed to promote a balance where all countries' sovereignties are respected and protected, and as we've said, a system that's open, stable and secure. Now, as a significant regional power, Australia's approach does involve very active soft diplomacy, which is not new. We have worked very closely in defence cooperation for, in some cases, many decades with our regional friends and partners. So what we do to work with our regional friends and allies is not new, but again, it doesn't come with strings, it doesn't come with coercion, and it comes as supporting and working with our regional friends, and they know that. And that is, again, that's incredibly important. So one of the things in engaging regionally that you and I talked about is about, we talk a lot about tone, that the tone that we take with regional partners is really important. And that if you put yourself in the shoes of other nations, and particularly smaller nations, of which we've got many in our region, if they've got 2 regional powers shouting at them or forcing them to choose, it's hard for them to tell who's their friend and who's not. So being a good friend, listening to what they want, and how we can best work with them to support their own sovereignty and aspirations is incredibly important. And those are some of the discussions I said that you and I had, and that continue. So that's what I'd say is look, listen, and be present in the region as well. And there is no, I mean, it's a bit hard at the moment with COVID, although things are starting to improve, but actually being present. And one final point I want to make in relation to China is I think that, we've got no doubt that we've seen changes in China's behaviour that really puts in question its willingness to meet the international commitments that it's signed up to. And that asserting itself and putting pressure on the systems of rules that has, for decades, mostly since World War II, has provided peace and prosperity for us and provided benefits to all nations. So there is no question in my mind that we are competing to preserve and shape for better that international order. Now, the international order is evolving, but again, how do we work together to shape and evolve that so that we preserve that international order? I'd also say that as China grows and achieves greater economic and also more significant strategic weight, I think it's not unreasonable for us to expect China to show greater responsibility in the region. And again, very strongly to our mind, that includes adhering to internationally agreed rules. And, as we've talked about today, respecting the sovereignty of other nations. We do seek a constructive relationship with China. We have made it clear we want to engage, but these offers haven't been taken up in recent times. But I'll just finish with this, Mark. There's 4 key principles that our relationship, from our perspective, will continue to be based on. The first one is a commitment to open markets and trade relationships based on international law, protecting our sovereignty, strengthening democratic institutions, and assisting others become more resilient to coercion in many, in all its forms. Respect for international law, but also, fourthly, is what we've discussed today, and that is really supporting and building more resilient regional infrastructures and architectures between us all. So look, it is a complicated relationship, but again, for us, it's about standing up for what we think is right, as we have together for a century.
No, thank you for that. And I do want to come back to the China-Australia relationship. And I guess those principles also apply to our European partners, because as you mentioned, you've spoken a lot about the regional challenge. Proximity matters, geography matters, and for you, our Japanese partners and others, the competition, the rivalry, the threat, if you will, is much more apparent. It's much more strongly felt. So the question is, how do we get more of, again, our European partners who are also Western liberal democracies who share all those same values and concerns? How do we get them to do more, to engage more, to address what is a global competition and an international challenge and not just a regional one? And for the United States, it was asking them, for example, to not allow Huawei to invest or build out their 5G network. So it's particular issues like that. And then the broader sense of this global competition is, how do you get more countries to stand behind and defend the international rules-based order and don't treat China as business as usual, because that is not right now the arc of Beijing when it comes to what their vision is and what they see as their goal.
Well, Mark, firstly, I'd say I think that's already happening, and we can see that in a number of ways. So Australia did really take the lead earlier on in relation to foreign interference legislation. Again, it wasn't country specific, but it's not country specific. But we also took the lead in protecting our critical infrastructure, particularly our critical telecommunications infrastructure, as we move into 5G and the Internet of Things, which makes that even more challenging, but even more important when we do that. And I think that the discussion, certainly with our European partners and with NATO in particular, has changed. I think they've become more focused and attuned to what's happening across the Indo-Pacific, not just in the South China Sea, but also sort of right across the entire, two oceans. So, for example, here in Perth, Germany's had a frigate here, which I think is the first time that they've done that. The Charles de Gaulle, I understand, is coming through the South Pacific. We've also got the Queen Elizabeth in the region now on an extended engagement across many nations with many of our friends. So I think that is happening. And I would also say that it's not just China. Clearly, Russia has become more active again in the Pacific, which I know that many of us are looking at and taking note of. So I'm very optimistic that that trend will continue as others hear our message about the importance of the Indo-Pacific, and that it is important and it does matter.
Very good points, and I appreciate you raising those as well. Back to China, Australia. So China is your largest trading partner, and yet the relationship has soured in the past couple of years, and Australia has paid an economic price for highlighting China's human rights abuses, for calling them out on COVID transparency and other things. And I think it was a very principled stand that Canberra took, and you and others in the government. So in your opinion, what does the Australia-China relationship look like for the foreseeable future?
Well, I'd say that that's up to China, actually, Mark. As I've said, we've made it very clear we want to engage. We're still engaging extensively economically. They have made their displeasure with some of the actions that we've taken. But again, it is just a matter of principle. We will always stand up for our sovereignty. Again, that's not nation specific, but China actually issued us with a series of 12 grievances, things like we have a free press and things like that. And there's really not much we can do about that except just be consistent and stand up and speak our truth, and that we continue to do.
Well, thank you for that. And I give great credit to Australia for standing up like that. And you have spoken loudly about human rights abuses. We continue to see deterioration in terms of democracy in Hong Kong, and not just there, of course, but in other places such as Tibet and Xinjiang, et cetera. This is not solely your fight. These are important issues to the United States and other countries as well. So how best can the global community work together, cooperate to confront China's human rights abuses?
I think it's incredibly important that we keep working together and we support each other. So it can be a lonely place if you're the only one who is standing up and being on the receiving end of punitive measures or sort of retaliations in a variety of ways. So I think actually supporting each other is very important, so that we are not only united on our message, we are also united in our pushback where we see people not adhering to international norms, rules-based order, and they're not respecting not only our own sovereignty, but not respecting that of others. So I think that's the first thing, is to make sure that we keep doing things together. And I see a lot of evidence of that. I think there's also some other areas in more coming back to the security and defence sector. So 2 years ago, I gave an address at Hudson Institute, and it was all about where I saw our bilateral military relationship progressing in particular, and identified 3 key areas, which again were things that we in our time pursued. But the first one probably is the most important, and that was ensuring that our deterrence and also our deterrent capabilities adapt together to our new challenges. And there's a lot to unpack in that issue in terms of industrial bases, force posture, a whole range of things. But again, I think we've made some great progress on that, and you could see that in the AUKUS agreement itself. So that's the first thing, is deterrence and deterrent capabilities. The second thing I talked about was how, and what we've been talking about today, is maintaining a strong and responsive Indo-Pacific focus. Again, bringing in our other, not just regional partners, but our European and NATO and other friends. But thirdly, I think it is incredibly important that we keep working on strengthening our military and our technological advantages with the technological developments by others in our region. You know, we have to move fast, and none of us, I think, can do it and should do it alone, and that there are great synergies to be had by doing that together. And again, you could see that in the AUKUS agreement, and particularly in the submarine, the first sort of tangible outcome of that, which was the submarine agreement. So I guess another point I would make is that we have to stand together on the issue of sovereignty and keep communicating to our friends in the region that they're not alone in terms of coercion, you know, in all the forms that it comes in. So I guess those are sort of the key things, Mark, that I think that we can keep working on. So we're not starting from scratch, but as you and I both know, is that while our goal in the region is to maintain peace, you can't do it from a position of weakness in the current environment. So that's where the work that we're doing military to military and Five Eyes and others is really so important.
Thank you for that last point on sovereignty, because we couldn't have scripted this better. But my next question was about, Australia has been a leader in the region when it comes to building partners and allies and helping smaller countries push back against bullying and intimidation from Beijing. And when we first met in August 2019 in Australia, you raised this with me about how do we help the Pacific Island countries. It was something that you were very passionate about. And after that trip and our discussion, I took that to heart and actually visited a few countries, spoke or spoke to leaders of others, because I do think it is an important part of the world that is often neglected. What is your assessment these days of the Pacific Island countries and how they're doing with regard to Chinese attempts to erode their sovereignty?
Look, my perception is that the Pacific region in all its various dispersed parts are like so many others are doing it really tough under COVID, and United States, Australia, and a number of our friends have worked very hard to support countries across the Pacific in terms of health support, primary health, and with vaccinations and COVID responses, which I think has been very well received. Because again, as I said before, our friendship doesn't come with strings. We're not looking for favours, we're not looking for paybacks, we're not looking for economic handcuffs. We're there as friends, and I know the region sees that, and I know that they appreciate that. But we are in a bit of a competition on occasions, but we don't look at it that way. We've had long-standing relationships, and those friendships continue, and the agreements and the arrangements that we provide that assistance are under long-standing agreements. So we're not fair-weathered friends, we're there for our friends, and the point I make is that they've been there for us as well. So you remember those really terrible black summer fires we had in Australia? The Pacific countries were the first nations to line up, and they had hundreds of people coming to Australia, and mostly military, who spent weeks and sometimes months helping us recover. So again, it's not a one-way friendship, and as I said, you can't buy that. You can't coerce it. Friendship takes trust, it takes time. And so that was, I guess, sort of my message to you at the time, and it remains that, is you have to be in the region, you have to be present, you have to listen as a friend and not shout at somebody when you don't agree with what they're doing. Because ultimately, if we are to truly respect other nations' sovereignty, we have to respect the decisions they make. And that might not always be, the decision that we would like them to make. But again, it's, we have to respect that.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm conscious of the time. You've been very generous with it. And I know it's late where you are. So, and I got just a couple more questions. Maybe we can do a quick speed round, a lightning round, as we like to say, and get your thoughts, because you give such thoughtful insight. So I'll throw the first one out. What are your thoughts on the U.S. joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership?
We'd welcome it.
Do you think
embrace it, in fact?
Should the current members of the CPTPP keep China out?
We'd welcome China.
Okay, interesting. Any thoughts on Japan's new Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, and what this means for Japanese defense spending, collective deterrence, et cetera? We've seen them pick up the pace. Certainly during my tenure, I've seen them engage a lot more and really move forward in terms of their own security and the relationship with us. It was already very strong, but any thoughts on what this means for the region?
Look, I think the relationship between ourselves and Japan has never been stronger, particularly in a military to military sense. And it certainly appears to have never been stronger with the United States as well. So I think that there is a lot of opportunities trilaterally for our nations, and the new Prime Minister is I think only indicating that will grow.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And the last question, since I've tortured you with 40 minutes of questions, one last chance to get your final thoughts on the future of the U.S.-Australia relationship, and what else should we do right now to strengthen it?
Well, I think with AUKUS and our submarine agreement, we are doing a lot, and the new agreements that have been signed will only keep strengthening what we're doing and deepening what we're doing, particularly in terms of, as I said, deterrence, in terms of technology. But the key message is that our world is changing really rapidly, and we have no choice. What I would say also is that the US military, power has so long underwritten my region and our region's peace and prosperity. But Australia firmly believes that the US should never have to, shoulder that burden alone, and that we absolutely remain committed to doing our share, not only to support you as an ally, but also our partners in the region. So I guess if I was to leave you with one message, it would be this, is that you simply can't buy or coerce genuine friendship and trust. And maintaining and growing these sophisticated alliances of regional and global networks is vital. But the decisive advantage, I think, at the end of the day, is not necessarily the military might that you have and the technical advantage that we share, but it's the fact that we offer friendship and respect, free of coercion and bribery. And we do that because we've always shared, a joint commitment to the rule of law, to sovereignty, but also quite fundamentally to liberal democracy. And that has come under challenge, so often in the last century, but we have always worked together as genuine friends because we like each other, we trust each other, and that still is the case today. So I think that is our decisive advantage, is that we offer friendship and we offer respect.
Great points. Thank you very much. I was going to say, the common values, the common experiences and histories, and the friendship between our peoples are the foundation of what's been a great 70 years, and I would say another 70 years looking ahead to build upon. So I'm hopeful and optimistic, and I think with leaders like you and Prime Minister Morrison in charge, I think we can continue to build upon that. So, Minister Linda Reynolds, thank you for joining us today. Your answers and comments, not surprisingly, were very thoughtful, strategic, and insightful. So just as we expected. So thank you very much for your time tonight in Australia.
So thank you, Mark. It was lovely to see you again and have this discussion. And again, thank you to the McCain Institute for organising this and for giving us this opportunity to have this chat. As I said, it's always taken great leadership and great national friendships, and we certainly have that. So thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Linda. And I also want to thank you, the audience, for tuning in to these conversations I'm having with global leaders about the challenges and opportunities the United States, its allies, and its partners are facing and will confront in the years to come. And then lastly, please follow the McCain Institute on Instagram and Twitter for updates for future events, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.